So let's just finish up with chapter one of The Rise of Military Robotics, our summary chapter. And I left off the previous video at basically World War II. And so, as I mentioned at the conclusion of that video, that the Allies, notably the Americans and the British, were not that heavily invested, relatively speaking, as were the Germans and the Japanese in a lot of high tech warfare in terms of autonomous weapons. Largely for economic availability of humans to do the work, the efficiency was greater. But of course, you go with what's more efficient. It's not a surprise, but things start to change. The question of efficiency starts to change. And after, in the post-World War II milieu, as I mentioned, you had an influx of German technology and science into both the former Soviet Union and into North America, especially into the United States in their rocket programs. And there was a shift in attitude overall that, instead of just a few countries heavily, everybody starts working on it. And that's been the dominant sort of strand of the 1950s today, is the increasing amount of high-tech weaponry and the move towards autonomous weapons. So overall, then, what do we have? Is remote controlled or robotic weapons have been used in war. This remote control idea, as we talked about earlier, with Tesla bringing in this idea of radio control, that's about 100-ish or more years old, but they didn't work that well, right? So the signals they tended to be weak. They couldn't amplify them, so there wasn't good control, even though you were in the beginning of autonomous weaponry. It still was pretty, shall we say, just rickety and unreliable. So they went with other stuff that was more reliable. Those of you that are old enough can remember, computers, trying to get online used to be a much bigger struggle than it used to be. It still is a big struggle in lots of areas, but I certainly, in my own personal experience, remember, high-speed hookups were a lot. They cut in and out a lot compared to the way they do now. Technology, making videos like this is somewhat time-consuming, but nothing like it was trying to make a video 20 years ago when you had to convert analog tapes and digitize them. Now everything is recorded digitally. So, and that brings up another one, and those are processor speed, which is something that's extremely important. I'll get to it in a second. So what we have is, the weaponry that was introduced in World War II eventually was developed and improved after World War II, but had, let's say, it's an interesting counterfactual. What would have happened if the work on the V-2 bomber would have started maybe 10 years earlier? That weapon might have changed the nature of the Second World War. It's always possible. So when these things start, the historical conditions has a big impact on eventually where the weaponry goes in terms of its development and ultimately its application. So sure, history could have been quite different if this weaponry had appeared earlier in the war. So what does history teach us? Well, I'm always leery about drawing big lessons from history. I'm certainly not going to predict on the basis of history, but history seems to reveal a slow but gradual improvement of these kinds of weapons. Not a surprising thing to say, but distant operated self-guiding weapons, they just kept getting better and better. And now it seems that this development leading up to the key idea of processing speeds is going to be the big leap forward. What we have is not necessarily that this big leap, we should regard it as a big discontinuity, but just something a little bit faster, but something not radically different, because these things have been improving, and maybe we're on the cusp of a very quick and big leap in improvement, but nothing really radically different in kind. So it doesn't seem that these weapons autonomy is anything more than a sliding scale, increasing levels of it, and there might be a quick slide in the scale that's coming up, and and this is largely because computers are, as some people say, maturing, whatever language you want to use. It's just they're getting faster and faster and faster. So data processing capability is just increasing Now, it may not matter so much for us if your computer is much faster than it is now in terms of, watching a video or whatever, or the resolution gets a little bit better. That may not make a big deal to our human experience. But so you might say, well, then why would they bother developing it? Well, as you're trying to develop increasingly complex machinery, then more data is going to be required to operate that machinery, and you're going to need increasingly faster and faster processors. And that's exactly where things seem to be going. And it seems that much of the technology is here to build some fairly advanced machines that we haven't quite seen yet. But the question is how to put all this stuff together. So how do you connect everything such that you can get this kind of machine? So it's not just developing the particular parts; it's being able to assemble it such that it works and works the way you want it to. So it might be said that the robotics of the future, maybe the next 10, 15 years, could be changing the nature of warfare quite dramatically, or possibly not. It's very difficult, as I said, and I'm very leery of trying to predict the future based on the past. But we have seen certainly some very interesting and startling and serious developments. So the next chapter, the next video, we'll look at some of the arguments and the issues, and the ensuing videos will look at the ethics that are involved in the increasing development of robotics in the field of warfare.